So I think we should start with half an hour sit. I can tell you all have a meditation practice, probably of many years standing. So I think the best thing is if I just ring the gong to start and also to finish, and that you do your practice during the intervening time. And then I'll give a little talk. Okay, well, I'm just become aware that this is the first time in over 12 months I've actually given a talk to people. The last 12 months I've been giving Dharma talks to my laptop with little heads bobbing around on the screen. So this feels much better, great improvement. Sorry? All right. Tonight's talk is Secular Faith for Dharma Practitioners. And one of my little obsessions is, or perhaps my main obsession as a meditation and Dharma teacher, is to try and make links between the Dharma and what is going on or what has been going on in Western culture, because we're trying to get the Dharma to sink roots into a Western culture in this country and many other countries as well. And the book I want to talk to you a bit about tonight came out last year, and it's kind of set the world of public philosophy on fire. And it's written by a Swedish philosopher, although he writes in English, Martin Hägglund, and his book is called This Life, Secular Faith and Spiritual Freedom. Now, Hägglund is not a Buddhist, but what he has to say, I think, is acutely relevant to people with an active Dharma practice. And so tonight I want to introduce his central idea, which is, as in the title of the talk, secular faith. And what's important about it, it seems to me, is it gets to the core of Dharma practice, and it gets to the core of the motivation that drives us to practice the Dharma, both in terms of our meditation practices and in our practice of ethics and wisdom in everyday life. But first I need to tease out what this odd expression, secular faith, can mean. And the reason is that in common parlance, these two words seem to not fit together, because secular seems to be a denial of faith, and faith seems to be something to do with religion. And so let's tease these two terms out to see how they do actually fit together. The word secular comes from the Latin word saeculum, which originally meant a human lifespan, and sometime later came to mean a century. And in many languages that derive from Latin, this is the way it's used, like in French, siècle, meaning a century. But it also carries the idea that what is secular exists in time. So secular is about time. And the Latin adjective, saecularis, means of this time, of this world, what is bounded by time. And so the opposite of that would be eternal, transcendent, and not of this world. So if you just forget about common usage of secular as being anti-religious or whatever, and just concentrate on that idea of it being about this world, this time, what we're experiencing now. And faith is also misunderstood, it seems to me. In common parlance, faith often refers to a religion. So, you know, when we have multi-faith communities, there are a bunch of people who believe different things, who have different religious stories in their heads. And all of these stories come from belief. They're beliefs that have been fostered by various holy persons or holy entities, and which deal with things that are beyond our normal experience. But again, if we look closely, the word, the concept and the word faith has meant something quite different. It has meant commitment. It has meant practical commitment. I mean, as Aristotle used it. So it really refers to really back to some sort of conversion process. If we have faith, it means we have accepted, we've taken on board something that is important to us, something to which we now owe our loyalty and our fidelity, which is another, really just another word for faith, fidelity. And this is how it turns up in the Dharma. In the Pali word saddha, which carries the meaning of commitment, practical commitment, loyalty, confidence. Often confidence refers to how we feel about the Dharma. We are confident about it. We're confident in the practice of the Dharma. We are confident in the guidance that we receive from the Buddha through the suttas and various contributors to the tradition since his time. So we find saddha turning up in one of those lists, one of those dharmic lists, and it's a list of the 5 spiritual faculties. And interestingly, it's the first one in the list. The other ones are energy, mindfulness, mental integration, and wisdom. But because of the placement of saddha or faith at the beginning of this list, we can tell that without it, we don't ever leave the starting blocks. It's where we begin. And often, of course, where we begin is in a conversion process that might have felt quite overwhelming, certainly convincing, and that sense of faith in the conversion has continued on. So we humans are secular beings in the sense that I've touched on. If you Google any historical figure, in the little box on the right-hand side, the first information is when this person was born and when she or he died. And just about everything you need to know about this person happened between those 2 dates or were achieved between those 2 dates. Those 2 dates bookend our lives. And even it's true of ordinary folks as well. You know, if you walk through a cemetery, the headstones will tell you when these people were born, the date, and the date they died. And and everything else is bookended by those dates. So what happens between those bookends is terribly important. And the Buddha summed up the most difficult of them, the most challenging of them, in his first discourse, when he introduced the concept of dukkha. So birth and death are there in the list as categories of dukkha, or suffering or difficulty, even some might say the tragic elements of our lives. But the other ones are illness, aging, being separated from whoever or whatever we love, being thrown together with whomever or whatever we detest, frustration, not getting what we want, and our whole fragility of mind and body. This, folks, is the human condition. And so fortunately, it's not the whole story. And in other contexts, the Buddha talked about the human condition in terms of our capacity for joy and our capacity for awakening. So if these are kind of like the three constituent parts of a human life: the dukkha, the sukha, and which is the Pali word for joy, and of course awakening, which is what this tradition is all about. But what is clear from when we look at the possibilities of joy and awakening, they are the achievements of beings, human beings, for whom everything is at risk the whole time. We have finite lifespans. We don't know, we have no idea when we're going to die. And during our lives, all sorts of vital elements of our lives are at risk. The people we love, the places we inhabit, even things like the opportunity to practice the Dharma and so on. So this idea of the components of our lives being at stake is what Hägglund is driving at. Nothing is guaranteed. We can lose anything, and indeed everything, in a heartbeat. And it's that which is driving, for most of us, this is what's driving our Dharma practice. This is, in this sense, we are practicing a secular faith. We are investing in this life, in this sense. And we're not doing it in spite of everything that goes wrong, of all the risks we're running. We're doing it because of the fragility and the uncertainty that we live with. This is what gives our practice its urgency. And this is what Hägglund is coming in on, this idea of the urgency of living this life. And of course, the main title of his book is precisely This Life. Now, if you imagine an opposite situation where our lives were guaranteed, perhaps, for 100 years or perhaps forever, if everybody that we cared about were equally lived guaranteed lives, if nothing could go wrong, what sort of existence would that be? It would be existence in which we wouldn't care about these things because they're going to be there anyway. And so it would be a denial of the fundamental ethical principle of the Dharma, which is care. And this word care, apamada in Pali, appears frequently in the Pali canon, and strangely enough is often mistranslated. But for instance, in the Dharma, in the Buddha's famous last words, things fall apart, tread the path with care, he used the word appamada, meaning precisely care. It didn't mean vigilance or diligence or any other common translations. It meant care. He also said on a number of occasions, he compared care with the footprint of an elephant. The footprint of the elephant can contain the footprint of any other animal in the jungle, by which he meant that every value, every virtue that the Dharma encompasses fits into this all-encompassing ethic of care. So we care because what we love and our own lives are all at risk. They're all at stake. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that the Dharma fits very comfortably into Hägglund's conception of secular faith. Is the faith of beings who are living without guarantees. It is their commitment to making the best of this life. And by that I mean, of course, developing the potential for awakening, the potential to realise the values that the Dharma teaches us, like love and compassion and generosity and patience. Now, Hägglund contrasts secular faith with what he calls religious faith. And I should make it quite clear that these two opposing conceptions of faith are, as it were, pure models. We're not referring, we can't put ourselves into one category or the other, because most of us probably work in both modes, as it were, both in terms of a secular faith and a religious faith. But if you look at the pure model of religious faith, it is actually seeing this life as something impure, as a kind of fallen way of life, as a not particularly attractive way of life. And for that reason, religious faith tends to then project the idea of another kind of existence, which is the opposite of what we ourselves know. So this would be a plane of existence which is transcendent, which is eternal, which is ecstatic, and of course, which is free of suffering. Now, one way of thinking about this is that the secular faith is saying yes to life. It is saying commit to this life. The religious faith, the pure model, is saying no to this life, is saying that it should be transcended. We should have our eyes on some other way of being. So religious faith in its pure form invites us to denigrate this life, the life we have with its commitments and its relationships that most of us, I think, find enrich it. And so in Christianity, of course, you've got a very clear example of this, the concept of heaven, where everything is wonderful, nothing ever changes, nothing ever happens. And you might start having a niggle thinking, that sounds a bit boring, actually. And a number of people have made that point. For beings like us, what is being offered here? Apart from the fact that it's may not be entirely plausible, what is desirable about it? One might even say, is this different from being dead? And when you find it in the, the Theravada, the pure model of the Theravada, that equation is made, when the fully awakened being dies, what they achieve is extinction. And I can remember many years ago at a talk that was given by Ajahn Brahmavangsa, where somebody asked him directly, what happened? What happens to the fully awakened being when she or he dies? And he said, poof, gone. I think it caused a certain amount of consternation in the audience. But anyway, what Hägglund goes on to say about this at some length is how this has affected famous religious figures in the Christian tradition, for instance. And he takes the example of St. Augustine, who was a very important 5th century contributor to Christian theology. Martin Luther, of course, the main figure in the Reformation, and C.S. Lewis, the 20th century theologian and writer who gave us the Narnia books, but who also wrote a lot about theology. Now, these three individuals each suffered an appalling loss during their lives. In Augustine's case, it was a very close friend. In Luther's case, it was his daughter. And in Lewis's case, it was his wife. Now, these were absolutely shattering moments for them. And all three of them left very long confessions, as they called them, or memoirs, of going through these terrible existential crises. Now, those of us who reach mature years, we're all going to have to face grief and mourning. It's in there in the definition of dukkha. But in the case of these three, because they were so absorbed in religious faith, that their suffering was laced with guilt. How come they were so affected by the death of another mortal being? And so they felt, this was a failure on their part, that they couldn't maintain their steady gaze on God and transcendence and all that sort of thing. It was a big problem for them. And yet here they were, their actual process of mourning was an affirmation of what Hägglund is calling secular faith. They had invested so much and actually been enriched so much by these relationships with other mortals, other people who were at risk. And much later on, of course, when that religious model that one should keep one's eye on God, etc., fell away, people became aware of the fact that grief and mourning were some of our major moments of growth into deeper and more spacious human beings. And probably the person who put his finger on it most convincingly was Sigmund Freud in his work Mourning and Melancholia, where he talks about mourning as something that you have to go through if you have a very significant death occur in your immediate family circle or from a good friend. It's a state of controlled madness, but what he calls it work. Mourning is work for Freud, and it's work that you come out the other side of a much deeper and more spacious human being. So the Dharma and its insight meditation practice lead us to consciously experience our ephemeral nature, our mortality, our being at risk. And of course, this matches the world, the life world we directly experience of being constantly in flux, constantly changing, things falling apart. So everything we touch is changing, and we ourselves have no fixed identity. And that's, of course, one of the three realizations we have in insight meditation, anatta, not self. So I guess I'll just finish up by saying, or pointing out what he says, that when we think about these other worlds that we don't really seem to be natives of, and may not be really either plausible or attractive to us, we can see that they would not be the answer to our dreams, but they would obliterate who we are. And so I just want to finish with one of my favourite poets and one of my many Buddhist friends' favourite poets, Mary Oliver, in a wonderful poem she wrote called In Blackwater Woods, which is really a poem about mourning, and it's set in a landscape that's been devastated by a bushfire. She's an American, or was an American, but we can all relate to the landscape of bushfires. And she ends the poem by saying, to live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. Okay, so we'll open it up for questions and comments. If you have thoughts to share.
Your talk reminded me that pop group The Smiths wrote a song called Heaven is the Place Where Nothing Ever Happens.
There'd be no 7 o'clock news.
Would you like to say a few words about Saint Augustine? He's my favorite saint because he was struggling a lot with sex.
Yes, he's famous for praying to God to take away his lust, but not yet. And said it was better to marry than to burn. Augustine was really interesting because it's the very first, he wrote probably what is the very first memoir. And it was very long. It's 13 volumes long. And so what he was trying to get at was how he came to his conversion experience and how it played out, what part it played in his life. So it wasn't a theology book. It wasn't a book of ideas. It was extremely personal. And Hägglund does a very interesting thing with it. He's sort of talking about that if we're going to practice our secular faith, we have to own our own lives. And we do that by intensively remembering the past, our own past, and bringing that to bear on how we understand how our lives are developing now. And so he compares Augustine in that way with two other famous writers, much more modern ones, who've done exactly the same thing. One was Marcel Proust, and the other one was Karl Ove Knausgård, the Norwegian writer. And they took from memory 7 volumes and 6 volumes, respectively, to write their memoirs. But they didn't write like, in 1972, I got my Bart's degree, and it's like remembering moments in time. And Augustine talked about his life being distended as he was writing his confessions. And it's a very interesting concept that he's introduced there. So if something is distended, it's stretched, it's made bigger, but at the same time, it's put under pressure to break. If you eat too much dinner, you have a sense that your stomach is distended. And that, the word I think, if I remember the Latin, mea vita est distentio, so is a distension. And that's exactly what Proust and Knausgård also did. There's a famous passage in Proust where he describes his aunt drinking a cup of tea and eating a madeleine, a little French cake. And it goes on for about 20 pages. And as an insight meditator, you can actually relate to that. You can see, on a good day 4 of the retreat, you can actually go into experiences in that kind of distended fashion. And it's that way Hägglund is saying that we own our lives. We get to really understand the dynamics of our experience. And, as I'm indicating, I guess, I think insight meditation does precisely that.
So Saint Augustine had some problems.
Don't we all?
That's what I wanted to say. It's not easy to be a man.
Oh, it's not easy to be an earthling of any kind, I guess. Any other questions or comments?
Thing if no one in the beginning, that was 50 years ago, when I became a Buddhist. One sentence really shocked me. It's not in the Sutta Nipata, it's a Theravada scripture. It was that even a little dung stings I wouldn't recommend even a little existence.
What was the first word? Can you just repeat that?
Well, even a little dung, or let's say shit.
Oh, right.
Things
Okay.
I wouldn't recommend, not even a little existence or becoming.
Hmm.
It took me 50 years to realize that he was right. Because life can be torture.
Yeah, it's interesting though to reflect on the fact that you know, the Buddha, like all human beings, was a child of his culture, and ancient Indian culture was very pessimistic. You know, it carried this very sort of basic assumption that life as a human being was pretty awful. Now, when the Dharma spread to China, it encountered another highly sophisticated civilization that didn't carry that assumption at all. In our terms, you know, the ancient Chinese culture was much more upbeat. And therefore, a lot of this kind of doom and gloom stuff gave way to an expression of the Dharma which was much more positively focused on living this life in a fine-grained way. So, you know, in Chan Buddhism, which gradually spread to Korea as Son and Japan as Zen, you know, there's a much greater sense of appreciation, if you like, of being alive.
Yes, still, he recommended that we should treasure life. That's our only chance to learn, to get better, and to overcome life. Like one day he set an example. He said, let's say there's a blind turtle swimming in the ocean. And he comes up every 100 years to the surface. And there's a wooden ring, and he puts his his head through that ring. That's your chance to become a human being. So we should really treasure it.
Yeah.
But still, the underlying law of nature is dukkha. We have to accept it.
And joy and the possibility of awakening. Okay, do you usually finish with a short sit, or do you just read? Let's do that. 2 minutes to quieten down.